They don't struggle to feel attraction, they struggle to feel safe. Avoidants don't bond easily because emotional closeness doesn't register as comfort to them. It registers as risk. Where others experience connection as warmth, avoidants experience it as pressure. The closer someone gets, the louder their internal alarms become. This isn't arrogance or emotional coldness. It's a nervous system trained to survive without depending on anyone. Most avoidants learned early that relying on others leads to disappointment, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. So they adapted. Independence became protection. Distance became stability. Bonding, which requires emotional surrender, feels like stepping into uncertainty without armor. When emotions deepen, avoidants begin scanning for danger. They watch reactions, test boundaries, and unconsciously create space to regain control. This is why bonding often triggers withdrawal, not because they don't care, but because caring feels like giving up the safety they built their identity around. Avoidants also associate intimacy with obligation. Emotional closeness implies expectations, needs, and responsibility. To them, bonding can feel like being trapped in someone else's emotional world. So they slow things down, intellectualize feelings, or minimize the connection, anything to prevent emotional enmeshment. Ironically, the more genuine the connection, the stronger their resistance becomes. Shallow interactions feel safe. Deep ones feel destabilizing. This is why avoidants may thrive at the beginning, but falter when emotional depth is required. Vulnerability threatens the self-sufficiency they rely on to feel grounded. Bonding requires trust, not just in another person, but in the belief that closeness won't erase them. Until avoidants feel emotionally sovereign and safe within themselves, connection will always feel like something to manage rather than something to surrender to. Understanding this shifts the narrative. Avoidants aren't withholding love. They're protecting themselves from emotional collapse. And until safety replaces survival, bonding will always feel like a risk they're not ready to take. Avoidant testing is not about control, manipulation, or emotional games. It's about fear. A quiet, deeply embedded fear that operates beneath logic and intention. The kind of fear that doesn't announce itself, but shapes behavior from the shadows. At the core of avoidant testing is the fear of emotional engulfment. Avoidants don't fear love itself, they fear losing themselves inside it. Emotional closeness feels like a slow erosion of autonomy, where their needs, boundaries, and identity might disappear under someone else's expectations. So before they bond, they test, not to dominate, but to see if they can remain intact. These tests often look subtle. Delayed replies, sudden emotional distance, pulling back right after intimacy. Each moment is a probe, asking a silent question. Will you collapse if I step away? Will you demand more than I can give? Will I still be me if I stay close to you? Avoidants learned early that depending on others came at a cost. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe closeness brought criticism, intrusion, or emotional chaos. Over time, their nervous system learned that safety lived in self-reliance. So when connection deepens, their body reacts before their mind does. Testing becomes a survival reflex, not a conscious choice. There is also a fear of exposure. Emotional bonding means being seen, flaws, vulnerabilities, unhealed wounds. Avoidants test to see how much truth the other person can hold without turning it into pressure, judgment, or disappointment. They are watching closely. Do you respect silence? Do you self-regulate? Do you remain grounded when I pull away? If the answer feels unsafe, they retreat, not because the connection wasn't real, but because it felt too real, too fast, too powerful. Ironically, avoidant testing often pushes away the very security they crave. The more they test, the more unstable the bond becomes. Yet from their perspective, these tests are necessary checkpoints. Emotional safety must be proven before vulnerability is allowed. Understanding this fear changes how you interpret their behavior. Avoidant testing is not rejection, it is hesitation shaped by survival. Until emotional closeness feels safe instead of threatening, testing will always precede bonding, and love, no matter how genuine, will remain something they approach with caution rather than surrender. Emotional intensity is loud. It rushes in fast, creates sparks, and feels intoxicating in the beginning. Emotional safety, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't overwhelm, impress, or demand attention. And this difference is exactly why so many people confuse passion for connection and chaos for depth. Intensity feeds on highs and lows. It thrives on uncertainty, longing, and emotional charge. The heart races, the mind obsesses, and every interaction feels meaningful because it's unpredictable. But intensity alone doesn't create stability. It creates dependency. The stronger the emotional surge, the weaker the sense of grounding becomes. Emotional safety works differently. It doesn't trigger adrenaline. It regulates the nervous system. Safety feels like being able to breathe without fear of abandonment or control. It allows emotions to exist without punishment, distance, or pressure. There's room for silence, disagreement, and individuality, without the bond feeling threatened. For avoidant individuals, emotional intensity can feel dangerous. Intense emotions often signal loss of control, expectations, and emotional invasion. Safety, however, allows connection without erasure. It proves that closeness doesn't require self-sacrifice. For anxious individuals, the opposite is often true. Intensity feels like proof of love. Safety can feel unfamiliar, even boring, because it doesn't activate old emotional patterns. But what feels dull at first may actually be secure. The most sustainable bonds are not built on emotional fireworks, but on emotional regulation. Safety allows intimacy to grow without fear. It creates trust not through dramatic gestures, but through consistency, respect, and emotional presence. When safety replaces intensity, love stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a choice. There is no need to chase, prove, or perform. Connection becomes something that strengthens, rather than destabilizes. True emotional depth isn't measured by how strongly you feel, but by how safe you are allowed to be. Push-pull behavior is one of the most emotionally confusing patterns in relationships, because it speaks two opposite languages at once. One moment, there is closeness, warmth, and genuine connection. The next, there is distance, silence, or sudden emotional withdrawal. What makes this pattern so powerful is not the pulling away, it's the return. Just when clarity feels lost, connection reappears, reigniting hope. This cycle is driven by an internal conflict, not by indecision about you. The pull happens when connection feels safe enough to enjoy. Emotional warmth, shared moments, and vulnerability activate longing and desire. But as soon as closeness deepens, the push is triggered. Intimacy activates fear, fear of dependence, loss of control, and emotional exposure. Push-pull behavior is the nervous system swinging between craving connection and protecting autonomy. When closeness feels manageable, they lean in. When it feels overwhelming, they retreat to regain emotional balance. The distance is not absence of feeling, it is self-regulation. What makes this dynamic addictive is the unpredictability. The emotional contrast creates heightened attachment in the other person. Relief follows withdrawal. Hope follows distance. The brain starts associating inconsistency with emotional reward, making it harder to step back objectively. Over time, this pattern erodes emotional stability. The person on the receiving end starts questioning their worth, overanalyzing behavior, and adjusting themselves to avoid triggering distance. Meanwhile, the cycle continues because the underlying fear remains unaddressed. Push-pull behavior does not resolve through reassurance, chasing, or emotional intensity. It stabilizes only when emotional safety replaces fear. Without safety, closeness will always trigger retreat. Understanding this pattern gives you power. It allows you to stop personalizing distance and recognize when connection is conditional. Awareness breaks the emotional spell, and clarity restores self-control. Avoidants rarely ask direct questions about your emotional limits. Instead, they observe. They create moments of distance, ambiguity, or silence, and quietly watch how you respond. These reactions tell them far more than words ever could. One common way avoidants test reactions is through emotional withdrawal. Messages slow down, affection becomes inconsistent, plans suddenly feel uncertain. This isn't always intentional strategy. It's an instinctive pause, designed to see whether you remain grounded or become emotionally dysregulated. Your response answers an unspoken question. Can you self-soothe without chasing me? Another test appears through boundary shifts. They may reduce availability, delay commitment conversations, or deflect emotional topics. This measures how you handle unmet needs. Do you express yourself calmly, or do emotions escalate into pressure? Avoidants interpret emotional intensity as danger, not devotion. Avoidance also tests through inconsistency. Warmth followed by coolness reveals whether you rely on their presence for emotional stability. If your mood rises and falls with their attention, they register risk. Stability in the face of fluctuation signals safety. Silence is another powerful test. Gaps in communication are not always disinterest, they are emotional stress tests. Avoidants watch whether silence turns into accusations, anxiety, or emotional collapse. Calm curiosity feels safe. Emotional urgency feels overwhelming. Even vulnerability can become a test. When avoidants share something personal, they are assessing how you hold it. Is it respected, or immediately turned into emotional demand? Do you allow space, or rush intimacy forward? These tests are not about winning or losing. They are survival checks, shaped by past experiences where closeness felt unsafe. Avoidants are scanning for emotional containment, proof that connection won't cost them autonomy. Understanding this changes everything. When reactions are regulated rather than reactive, safety increases. And when safety increases, testing slowly fades. The moment feelings begin to deepen is often the exact moment avoidants step back. What looks like emotional coldness is actually an internal overload, a clash between desire and fear, happening beneath the surface. As feelings grow, emotional closeness stops being abstract and starts becoming real. Real connection requires presence, vulnerability, and consistency. For avoidance, this shift activates an old internal warning. Closeness equals loss of control. The bond no longer feels optional, it feels consequential. And that sense of consequence triggers retreat. Withdrawal is not a lack of interest. It is an attempt to regulate overwhelming emotion. When feelings intensify, avoidants experience a surge of internal pressure, expectations, responsibility, and fear of dependency. Stepping back allows them to regain emotional equilibrium. Distance becomes the fastest way to feel safe again. There is also fear of exposure. Growing feelings mean being seen beyond the curated version of self. Flaws, limitations, and unmet emotional capacity come into focus. Withdrawal protects them from being discovered as not enough, or from disappointing someone they care about. Ironically, deeper feelings increase the risk of loss. The more they care, the more they stand to lose. Avoidants often learned early that attachment ends in pain or abandonment. So when emotions intensify, their nervous system urges preemptive retreat. Leaving before leaving can hurt. This withdrawal can feel sudden and confusing to the other person. Connection was building, signals felt mutual, then space appears without explanation. But internally, the avoidant is not disconnecting, they are bracing. Understanding this pattern reframes the experience. Withdrawal is not rejection, it is self-protection. Until emotional closeness feels safe instead of threatening, distance will continue to appear right where intimacy begins. When avoidants sense emotional closeness approaching a level that feels unsafe, their behavior shifts. The change is subtle, but intentional. A series of quiet tests designed to measure emotional risk without ever naming it. These tests are not random. They are alarms wrapped in behavior. One common test is increased unpredictability. Communication becomes inconsistent. Warmth appears, then vanishes. This isn't confusion, it's assessment. They are watching how you respond to instability. Do you remain emotionally steady, or does uncertainty unravel you? Emotional reactivity signals risk. Emotional self-regulation signals safety. Another test involves delayed commitment cues. Conversations about the future are avoided, postponed, or minimized. This gauges whether emotional closeness will turn into pressure. If future talk triggers urgency, expectations, or anxiety, avoidants register danger. Calm openness feels safer than emotional insistence. Avoidants also test through emotional minimalism. They share less, offer fewer reassurances, or downplay moments of connection. This checks whether intimacy can exist without constant validation. A need for repeated reassurance feels overwhelming. Emotional independence feels stabilizing. Silence itself becomes a test. Extended gaps in communication reveal how someone handles emotional ambiguity. Does silence provoke accusation, panic, or self-abandonment? Or does it invite reflection and grounded response? Avoidants associate emotional collapse with loss of autonomy, a major risk signal. Even moments of closeness can turn into tests. After vulnerability, avoidants watch whether emotional demand increases. If closeness leads to expectation, they retreat. If closeness is met with space and respect, safety increases. These tests are not conscious manipulation. They are protective strategies shaped by earlier emotional experiences where closeness came at a cost. Emotional risk, to an avoidant, is not heartbreak, it is emotional capture. Understanding these signals helps you respond with clarity rather than confusion. When you recognize the test, you stop chasing reassurance and start maintaining emotional sovereignty. And safety, not intensity, becomes the language that de-escalates fear. Avoidant control is rarely about power over another person. It is about power over emotional exposure. Beneath the surface, control becomes the strategy that allows avoidants to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed, dependent, or emotionally trapped. At its core, avoidant control is a response to unpredictability. Early experiences taught them that closeness came with emotional intrusion, criticism, or instability. Control became the substitute for safety. If emotions could be managed, minimized, or delayed, pain could be avoided. So instead of surrendering to connection, they regulated. This control often appears as pacing the relationship on their terms. They decide when closeness happens, how much vulnerability is shared, and when distance is reintroduced. Not because they lack feeling, but because emotional intensity feels destabilizing. By controlling rhythm, they reduce internal anxiety. Avoidants also use emotional restraint as a form of self-protection. Limiting expression keeps attachment at a manageable level. Strong feelings threaten the identity they built around self-sufficiency. Control allows them to experience connection without losing autonomy. Silence, withdrawal, and emotional ambiguity are not accidental. These behaviors create space where avoidants feel grounded again. When emotions escalate, control restores balance. Distance calms the nervous system. Structure replaces vulnerability. Ironically, control often produces the very instability avoidants fear. The other person begins adapting, overthinking, and emotionally compensating. This reinforces the avoidant's belief that closeness leads to imbalance, strengthening the need for further control. Avoidant control is not healed through reassurance or pressure. It softens when emotional safety replaces fear. When connection doesn't demand surrender, control becomes unnecessary. Understanding this psychology reframes the dynamic. Avoidants are not withholding love to dominate. They are using control to survive emotional closeness they were never taught to navigate safely. Secure energy doesn't chase, prove, or perform. It shifts the entire emotional atmosphere of a connection, quietly, consistently, and powerfully. Where anxiety tightens and avoidance retreats, secure energy stabilizes. It becomes the emotional anchor that changes how relationships unfold. Secure energy begins with self-regulation. Emotions are felt, but they are not outsourced. Validation is appreciated, not required for emotional survival. This internal steadiness sends a subtle message. Connection is welcome, but not needed to feel whole. That message alone alters dynamics more than any strategy ever could. In the presence of secure energy, pressure dissolves. There is no emotional urgency, no fear-driven closeness, no silent demand for reassurance. Space is allowed without punishment. Closeness is offered without expectation. This balance is what makes secure energy feel safe, especially to those who fear being consumed by intimacy. Secure energy also changes communication. Boundaries are clear without being rigid. Needs are expressed without emotional charge. Silence is not interpreted as abandonment, and distance is not chased. This removes the emotional volatility that destabilizes connection. For avoidance, secure energy disarms defense. When closeness no longer threatens autonomy, control becomes unnecessary. The nervous system relaxes. Testing fades. Trust begins to form, not because it was demanded, but because it was demonstrated through consistency. For anxious partners, secure energy restores self-respect. The urge to overextend, over-explain, or self-abandon softens. It shifts relationships from emotional survival to emotional choice. Connection becomes something you participate in, not something you cling to. This is why secure energy changes everything. It doesn't convince, persuade, or chase love. It creates the conditions where love can exist without fear. Emotional clarity is the moment confusion loses its power. It arrives when patterns become visible, excuses fall away, and feelings are no longer mistaken for facts. Clarity doesn't erase emotion. It organizes it. Instead of asking why something hurts, You begin to understand how it works, and understanding restores control. Strength grows from this awareness, not the loud, forceful kind, but the quiet strength of self-trust. Emotional strength is the ability to stay grounded when answers are delayed, when behavior is inconsistent, and when connection no longer aligns with your well-being. It is choosing dignity over desperation, presence over pursuit. With clarity and strength comes closure, not as an event, but as a decision. Closure is often misunderstood as something another person gives. In reality, it is something you claim. It happens when you stop negotiating with confusion and start honoring your emotional reality. Closure does not require explanation, apology, or acknowledgement. It requires acceptance. This process shifts how you relate to the past. Instead of replaying moments, you integrate them. Lessons replace longing. Patterns replace personalization. Emotional energy returns to where it belongs, within you. Closure is not bitterness. It is release. It is the ability to remember without reopening wounds, to reflect without re-entering emotional loops. Strength allows you to walk forward without dragging unanswered questions behind you. Emotional clarity sharpens boundaries. Strength protects them. Closure frees you from waiting. Together they create emotional sovereignty, the capacity to choose peace over chaos and self-respect over emotional noise. When clarity replaces confusion, strength replaces self-doubt, and closure replaces waiting, you stop surviving relationships and start honoring yourself.